So let's say you found the skeleton. How would you tell it to die? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey everybody, thanks for coming. Welcome to Leaving Young Earth Creationism. Here with Andrian, Time Swift. I just want to say, sorry for basically lying to everyone and saying that I couldn't do a stream today. That was all just a cover to make it seem like yesterday's stream was legit, even though it was an April Fool's joke. This has actually been scheduled for a while now, and unfortunately I had to hide that fact in order to make it seem like I actually had a reason for doing a Kent with Bent yesterday, which then ended up just being a joke about going through Kent with Bent and Klingon for like 5 minutes. Andrian, say hello to everybody. How are you?
Hi, everybody. I am doing all right today. Absolutely fantastic to be here.
Awesome. Well, as everyone knows, this is a Leaving Young Earth Creationism. So while we are going to focus primarily on that fact, I do want to say that the Patreon drive is still running. However, I don't actually know how far away we are from the goal for certain, because as happens every month, some of the charges end up being declined at the first of the month, and then emails get sent out automatically by Patreon, and then people update their payments, and then those canceled payments, or not canceled, but declined payments trickle in for, a few more days. And so I will say we're probably somewhere around $50-something from the goal, so we're not that far off, I'm pretty sure. So if you do want to help support the channel, that is a great way to do it. It is getting the channel to be self-sustaining so that it is not costing me money to continue to do the channel as to the level that I am still. Because it has been costing me money for 2 years, and I would like it to get to break even or better, if possible. That would go a long ways towards doing that. So, and if you can't afford it, please don't. But anyway, we're not really here for a big commercial, even though I will probably give at least one more. We're here to talk about Andrian leaving Young Earth Creationism. So before we get into that, Andrian, is there anything you want to tell people? Any place that, if they wanted to find you, that they could find you, or any other preamble stuff before we get into your history in creationism?
No. I do have a few things, but I'm not really comfortable sharing those. So I'm more just wanting to talk and share my experience on here. I hope that's all right.
No, that's perfectly fine. So I guess the first thing is you sent me your the avatar that I used for this, the thumbnail for this, and
Yes.
so it's pretty obvious to people who are familiar with the iconography that you are a former Seventh-day Adventist.
Yes, I
And
am. And most people don't know what Seventh-day Adventists are, which is really fascinating because they kind of started young Earth creationism.
they did, yeah.
Um,
That's one of the interesting things, and also one of the things that most creationists like to sweep under the rug, because Seventh-day Adventism is not popular with like mainstream Protestant America.
no. And um, it, it, we often get lumped in with like Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses, and not entirely unfairly. um, or well, I say we. I'm a former Seventh-day Adventist, but I still sometimes think of myself as being part of the group. I don't know how to explain it. It's just sort of a Freudian slip sort of thing.
It's all right. I don't think anyone's gonna come down on you like, oh, you can't say we. You're a form. Like, we get it.
um, and so so in case anybody's wondering, Seventh-day Adventism is a uh, largely fundamentalist, though there is some variation, and I will get into that as we go into my story. Branch of Christianity. Um, I would say it is probably closer to your standard evangelical Christianity than Mormonism or Jehovah's Witnesses, but they do share a historical uh, common ancestor, which is the Millerite movement, which William Miller lived in the 1800s, and he was kind of the Harold Camping of his day. He predicted that Jesus was going to come back at first in 1843 and then twice in 1844, um, and the last time is at which point he couldn't make his Bible math work anymore, is known as the Great Disappointment. Um, and it's actually really fascinating. People were like selling their houses
Hmm.
and like quitting their jobs, and so because they were expecting Jesus to come back, and it never happened. And out of that grew several different uh, denominations, and religious movements. One of which was Seventh Day Adventism, um, which believed that Miller got his math right, but he interpreted what happened on that date wrong.
Mm. Of course, that happens a lot with Jehovah's Witnesses. Like, oh well, this was a significant date, but
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. Um, and the the specifics of what Adventists think is very hard to explain briefly. It involves going into like the specifics of the tabernacle ceremonies and what happens on the Day of Atonement, and then copying all of that into the heavenly realm and what Jesus is doing, because of course everything that happened in the Old Testament was sort of a reflection of what Jesus was going to do, all kinds of complicated stuff like that.
Mhm.
So, but essentially, what happens in 1844 is that Jesus starts getting ready to come back.
Yeah.
Um, what he was doing before then, nobody knows. Just, I guess, watching Netflix.
Hey man, there's some good stuff that's being made. Maybe he's just cracking open some cold ones with the angels.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you know, being being a human for 30 years and then being dead for 36 hours, that's really tough. And it probably takes, 1800 years of rest to recover from that.
I mean, I've never come back from the dead, but I can imagine why it might be tiring.
And I shouldn't throw too much shade. I have fatigue problems myself. Another thing that's related to young Earth creationism, and which we can get into later. So I do spend an awful lot of time asleep or lying down. So I can't throw too much shade. But I've never managed to waste 2,000 years
Yet,
yet.
there's hope.
If I ever do, that will be a major accomplishment, and I want an award for it.
You'll probably get one at that point. So okay, were you raised in the Seventh Day Adventist religion?
Yes, both of my parents come from Adventist backgrounds. My grandfather is a pastor, and my father, his son, is also a pastor in the Seventh Day Adventist Church. Um, my parents were they went to the same church for a while. My grandfather was the pastor of my mother's church, um, which is how they met. Um, and I was scandalously conceived out of wedlock, which was a big thing in the family. And My parents married when I was like one,
Okay.
and then divorced when I was like three. It was not a very happy union. Um, so, and part of the reason that my parents divorced was because my dad wanted to become a pastor, and my mom did not want to become a pastor's wife. Also, there was some other stuff going on that I don't really want to get into,
That's fair.
um, but the important takeaway is that there are Adventists for several generations on both sides of my family, um, and I ended up being carted back and forth between these different parts of my family quite regularly, as a result of the divorce.
But either way, the Seventh Day Adventism was still part of the background of both families, so that didn't change.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of baked into my DNA. Uh, only only in the past few years have some of the younger members of the family started leaving Seventh Day Adventism. Um, but virtually everybody started out Seventh Day Adventist
Okay.
in my family. Um,
And so,
you
like
have to,
oh, sorry.
yeah, you have to go back like to my great grandparents. In some cases, even farther, depending on which side of the family we're talking about, before you get people who were not Seventh Day Adventists.
Right. Okay, so this was obviously something that was taught at church. Did you go to a public school, or was there private schooling or homeschooling?
Yeah. Okay. So, I went to private schooling for all of elementary school. I started out at a non-denominational Christian school. That school then split. One half went Baptist. The other half split off and stayed non-denominational and kept most of the staff from the original school. And so I went to the non-denominational one. Um, and that was until fifth grade. Sixth and seventh grade, I started attending what was essentially a one-room Adventist school, um, where my uncle uh, was the teacher. Um, and I was the only person in my grade for those 2 years. And I think they went all the way down to first grade and all the way up to eighth grade uh, at that school. Um, and my closest friend was like 2 years younger than me at the time.
Okay.
Well, my closest school friend, I should say. Um, um, and so I was taught young Earth creationism in school during that entire period, though it wasn't always from a Seventh Day Adventist perspective. Um, so I got practice early at being that annoying kid who was constantly correcting the teacher on religious grounds.
Okay.
You know, the one
Oh
that
yeah.
shows up in, like, the John and Jane skits.
Yeah. The one who has the really bad quote unquote counterpoints that the teacher
Yes.
doesn't really have time to get into.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I was that kid.
Okay. Now that was after this. You said you spent 2 years in this other school. So
Yes.
those
Well,
that was what,
so
through eighth grade?
so that takes me up to seventh grade.
Okay,
In
seven.
eighth, yeah. So first through fifth, I was in a non-denominational Christian school, and then I switched to a Seventh Day Adventist school, specifically school, and then. In eighth grade, I went to public school. I wanted to go to a vocational school. I was really into computer programming, and I wanted to learn computer programming in high school. Um, And in order to do that, the easiest route was to go to my local public school and then transfer when I switched to high school into into uh, into that school. So eighth grade was very difficult. I'm sure that anyone who has been through middle school can identify with middle school being difficult. It was even more difficult for me because I didn't swear. I didn't understand any of the um, double entendres and like slang. Um, so like for me, and I kind of spoke a bit of an archaic kind of 1950s uh, version of English
Yeah.
at the time. So like to me, gay meant like happy, queer meant unusual, that sort of thing.
Hmm.
Um, and it took me forever to learn to navigate that, and I was uh, mildly bullied during that period of adjustment. So I was definitely the sort of person who was interested in science growing up. I love nature documentaries. It was one of the few things that I was allowed to do on Saturdays. Was watch nature stuff. Seventh Day Adventists, one of their big doctrines is that Saturday is the Sabbath and it's supposed to be devoted entirely to God. So you're not allowed to do any work, but you're also not allowed to do any non-God play things. So it was basically watch VeggieTales or nature documentaries, or go on hikes, that kind of thing was
Now, was this
basically.
back when VeggieTales was still pretty good, or is this like the after?
Yes.
Okay, okay,
Yes. This was VeggieTales of like the early 2000s. um,
okay. Yeah, because after the movie, everything went downhill for VeggieTales.
yeah, it really did. That's not to say that there aren't some parts of VeggieTales that I like, that are post Jonah, but um, but yeah, the quality definitely dropped. And I still unironically love VeggieTales. I can sing the cheeseburger song in Mr. Lunt's voice, that kind of thing. So, um, but
Look,
and
VeggieTales
I
was before people realized that you could just slap the word Christian on any old crap and then it would sell. It was back when people making Christian media actually felt like they had to make good media.
well, I wouldn't necessarily say that. Um, but VeggieTales was I think VeggieTales is a bit of an anomaly, because the uh, because a lot of the media that I consumed at that point was really badly made cartoons of like Bible stories, and I mean like really bad, um, or like terrible claymation of the nativity story, that kind of stuff. Um, it's um, like today you get like with Jehovah's Witness, the Caleb and Sophia stuff. That stuff is far and away better quality than a lot of the stuff that I had access to as a kid.
Yeah, the
Um,
animation quality on Caleb and Sophia is pretty great. The actual content is usually horrifying.
the content is horrifying, but on a technical level, that stuff is fantastic. The voice acting,
Mhm.
the writing, um, the animation, that stuff is all really, really well done. Um, uh, Now there were some exceptions. I do have a bit of a soft spot in my heart for the anime Superbook.
Well, let's bring it back around to you were watching nature documentaries
Hmm.
on Saturdays because, as you said, basically it if it was leisure, it had still had to have something to do with God because, in addition to being a day of rest, apparently non-religious leisure activities are also not okay.
Yeah, there were debates about whether or not you could even like play basketball, and the general rule that applied mostly where I was you can toss the basketball around and shoot hoops, but you cannot play competitively. You can't keep score or anything like that. Um, that's the level of
You can
like.
practice basketball. You can't play
Yeah,
basketball.
yeah, well, and you can't even really practice. It's supposed to be like spending time with your friends kind of things, or just sort of
Okay.
taking care of the temple of your body, that kind of thing. But you're not really trying to get better at basketball,
Okay.
if that makes sense. Anyway, so going back to the nature documentaries, um, generally we would generally things about like dinosaurs or evolution specifically would be avoided. But those old National Geographic kind of things that were about, oh look how cool lemurs are, you know that kind of thing was perfectly fine. Um, but uh, but I was taught very early on to learn to sort of do this sort of editing process in my head, where anytime someone said millions of years, no, that's not true. It was 4,000 or 6,000, depending on what specifically we're talking about, that kind of thing.
Hmm.
And you just sort of go through and like um it's like a real-time redaction kind of thing that goes on.
Yeah, like every time they say, "Oh, this was 50,000 years ago." Nope, nope. It was like 4,000 years ago.
Yeah, exactly. um you know or yeah, that kind of thing, or this animal evolved to be this way. No, it was created to be this way. um
Mhm.
you know and so This was something that that was started with my parents, where we'd be watching it, and then anytime that would happen, um, my my parental figure would say, "No, that's not true. This is what actually happened." Um, and then as I got older, I learned to do it for myself.
Right.
Um, uh, I was definitely into the creationism side of things. I was very into science. Especially zoology and animals. I love that kind of thing. Um, and so I learned a lot of the creationist arguments growing up. I don't know if you've seen one of Logic's very old series where he goes through and reviews a creationist cartoon. Well, not a cartoon, a comic book.
Oh,
But
about the dinosaurs and the flood?
yes, yes, that one. Um, I had that exact book.
You're kidding
Uh,
me.
no,
That's awesome. Oh my goodness.
that book was produced by Amazing Facts, which is an Adventist organization, and I read and reread that thing. One of my favorite parts was the dramatization of Satan sending the dinosaurs to destroy the Ark.
Yeah, the satanic ark attack by the dinosaurs. I mean, it's okay. I'll say this: it's a fun fan fiction, right?
It is a very fun fan fiction.
I don't know that anyone should take it more seriously than that, creationists included. But like, I'll just say interesting take. Interesting
It, it,
take.
there were a lot of interesting takes in that, and I really wish that I'd held on to my copy of it, because there's some very funny things in there, like the one-eyed Tyrannosaurus Rex. It evolved an eye on one side of its head, so now it needs to evolve an eye on the other side.
Yeah.
Or the Stegoamoeba, which is a which is an amoeba which is shaped like a stegosaurus and is dreaming about evolving into a multi-celled stegosaurus.
Fun fact: animals didn't evolve from amoebas. Everybody. Like amoebozoa is the sister group basically to obozoa, and then within obozoa there are multiple groups including animals and their sister group choanoflagellates. So like, yeah, you gotta go several clades back up the ladder to get to amoebas.
Yeah. Um, so that's the level of scientific ignorance that I was growing up uh, with regards to evolution. That's what I thought it was like animals wanted to become something, and so they did, or maybe like the hopeful monster theory, which was a lizard lays an egg and a bird hatches from it, um, that kind of thing. Um, a- Absolute ludicrous nonsense, and it's no wonder when when you are raised to think that that's what the theory of evolution teaches, that that scientists must be like lying intentionally, because there's no way anyone could believe this seriously.
Right.
Um, but and it was not until actually I left Adventism that I started to look into evolution and realized, oh, this is not the nonsense I was told it was. Um, so so going back to my education, I intentionally avoided biology classes when I was attending uh, a secular school. Um, I would have avoided sex ed classes as well, but they were mandatory. Um, the religion that I was, the form of religion that I grew up in was very um,
Prudish.
repressed.
Okay, repressed.
Prudish is a good word. Yes. They're uh, and so uh, not to get into too much detail, but um, you know, any kind of sexual activity, including lustful thoughts, was sinful, um, and uh, being your standard heterosexual teenage boy, um, that was that made not sinning impossible. um,
Yeah, yeah.
you know, um, and so this caused a lot of like guilt and self-hatred. I have had depression since I was 7. At least I remember being depressed at the first time that I remember like having depressive thoughts and expressing any kind of any kind of like self-loathing was at 7. Um, but um, but this really exacerbated it. um, you know, because when you're trying constantly to do something that you're told should be possible, God's not going to give you anything that's harder than you can handle. All things are possible with God, that kind of thing. And when you're praying constantly to be freed from your natural biological urges and you're not, um, it's it wreaks havoc on you,
Hmm.
and your self-esteem. It absolutely awful. Um, Between that and some of the trauma that I suffered as a result of family stuff, I was very closed off during most of my teenage years, and um, I had I had trouble interacting with girls. Um, Not in that I had trouble uh, interacting with them on a personality level, but like I struggled because I had been taught by like books like the Everyman's Battle series. I don't know if you've heard about those.
I don't think I have.
Okay, well, they are a series of books about how to not masturbate and and remain faithful and just generally be sexually pure. And one of the things that they include in those books, which actually are surprisingly pornographic in their writing sometimes, um,
Of
uh,
course. Why wouldn't they be? My goodness.
it's it's kind of fun. You could do dramatic readings of certain parts of like the guy who got distracted by looking at a jogger so much that he rear-ended the car in front of him, that kind of thing. Um, uh, anyway, um, but those books will teach you to like bounce your eyes away from anything sexual, which meant that I couldn't like if a girl's shirt had writing on it, I wouldn't I would try very hard not to look at it and read it,
Right.
which you know th- that kind of puts a damper on your ability to like interact socially. Um, and this happening during high school made it all the worse because everyone's awkward and socially it's already you're already having the problem that you're a teenager, but then also all of this on top of it making it even worse. um, I was a bit of an oddity, a well-known oddity, a well-liked oddity, I think, um, but definitely an oddity.
Right.
uh, um, and that's very isolating.
Yeah.
um, so uh, that was something that I eventually I eventually learned to open up and do better in those kinds of areas with social interaction. But it was a difficult road, and I'm not sure that I've really totally recovered from that handicap.
Okay. And so you went to public for all of high school, right?
Yes, I went to public school for all of high school. Um, And high school was actually one of the first places where my journey out of creationism started, even though I did not realize it at the time. And that is because my chemistry teacher, um, to whom I am eternally grateful, um, and he found me hilarious because um, I was very smart and liked to show off how smart I was. So, like, he would ask what pi was, and he was dealing with students who couldn't even get to 3.
Right.
And then I would be putting in like the first 10 digits and saying approximately afterwards.
Nice.
Um, and so, but he explained what a scientific theory was. Um, and that was, I didn't realize it at the time how pivotal that would be, but it was very important for me to realize that the uh, the "it's only a theory" objection, which I'd been taught to parrot my entire life, wasn't
Mhm.
valid. Um, that a theory was actually um, that actually meant that it was highly supported by the evidence and that it had a ton of support for it, and that it was basically the highest kind of proof that you can get. that that was a big thing, even though I did not realize it at the time. So after high school, I went to a public school for a year. I graduated second in my class in high school, and so I got a free ride to the local public school. Um, and um, and During that time, I started to really have some spiritual doubts, and just as often happens to people at that stage in life, I started to reevaluate my priorities and wonder, what is it that I really want out of life. My years long passion for computer programming just sort of dried up. Um, and I uh, and I really wasn't sure what I wanted to do with my life, but I felt like I was being called to do some kind of ministry. Maybe not necessarily preaching, but maybe some kind of missionary work or something.
Mhm.
Um, so I gave up my free ride to the local public high school, went uh, I and I went to uh, an Adventist school on the other side of the country, in Washington. Um, and while it was absolutely stupid, and I really wish I had not done that,
Fair.
um, in terms of financial choices. Um, but I met some great people and had some very important experiences uh, during the during the 2 years that I spent out in Washington at the Adventist school that eventually led me out of young Earth creationism. And I'm not sure if I would have. I'm not sure if I would have left otherwise, or uh, if I would have been able to. I'm not sure. Part of it was getting away from my parents,
Mhm.
my mother in particular, getting out of the house and having to be on my own and having the freedom to like think about things and ponder things and not be discouraged from asking questions, was a big thing. Uh, and part of it was that I was now in a place where I could study theology, and was being exposed to a lot of information that just doesn't ever make it to people in the pews about the Bible and about ancient Hebrew cosmology and that kind of thing.
Mhm.
Um, and so it's one of those. I wish I had stayed because then I could actually have maybe finished my degree. Um, but I am glad that I went because it meant that I got to accomplish what I think is the greatest thing, the greatest accomplishment of my life, and the thing that has improved my life the most, at least in terms of my emotional well-being and my intellectual satisfaction.
Okay. So
Um,
at
yeah,
this point, so I'm just trying to make sure that I have an understanding where you are, like in terms of
yeah,
understanding of science and whatnot. So
yep,
you've gone through um, 5 years of public grade school, right?
yep.
And
Well,
during that,
no, I went through 5 years of public. It was high school, and it was high school and 1 year of middle school. But yeah,
okay, so
um,
and during that time, were being taught evolution?
Not really.
Okay.
I was able to avoid it. Instead of taking biology, I took physics or chemistry. Um, so I mostly missed all of that.
Hmm.
Um, I intentionally avoided it. I intentionally avoided anything where I would be exposed to what I thought would be the lies, the secular lies of my science teachers. Um, and so evolution was not really very big on my radar at this point in time. Um, I was much more interested in philosophy. Um, and in my first year of secular college, uh, I took an intro to philosophy class um, by a teacher who describes herself as a militant agnostic. I don't know, and you don't either.
Okay, fair enough.
I think it's something of a joke. She's also she's also an atheist, but she she says militant agnostic because her point is to say, look, there's these unknowns, and they are unknowable in terms of
Right.
certain spiritual things.
Yeah, that's
So
for the strong agnostic position.
yeah. Um, but of course, she wasn't pushing that kind of stuff. But we did go through the common arguments. We went through like Anselm's ontological argument for God. We went through, which was bloody confusing, and
Yes, it
as a
is.
and even as a dyed in the wool young Earth creationist child, well, I was an adult at this point, but you get what I mean.
Mhm.
I thought that it was a terribly stupid argument. um, Not only was it very difficult to follow because of all the repetition of that which than no greater can be conceived, um, but also it just didn't make any sense to me. Like, to me, God was this empirical thing. Like, you could you could go out into the world and find God. So why are you trying to conjure him into existence by definition? Um, and we also went through, the cosmological arguments, the teleological arguments. Um, the teacher actually specifically went into the second law of thermodynamics objection. Um, Mentioned some of the creationist things that I'd never heard about, like God and or Satan hid the dinosaur bones to test us.
Yeah, I've heard that one in the wild before. It's not just a
Yeah,
hypothetical.
I have encountered that in the wild, though it's very rare. Um, Especially now. I mean, most young Earth creationists don't think that at all. They take the Ken Ham view with that dinosaurs actually support uh, the Bible. Um, One interesting thing about Seventh Day Adventists is that they are divided on whether or not dinosaurs were created on the sixth day of creation.
What other day would they have been created on?
They wouldn't have been created on a day of creation. Some of
Oh.
them believe that ancient humans were doing some kind of hybridization and or genetic engineering to create these monsters.
Aha.
Um,
Okay. Interesting.
yeah, and so that's what they think that dinosaurs are. So they don't think that dinosaurs are in heaven. They don't think that dinosaurs were on the ark. They don't think that God created dinosaurs, which gets around a lot of the
Ah.
problems in young Earth creationism. Honestly,
Also, that's
um,
why they could be tricked by Satan into attacking the Ark.
yes, exactly.
Sorry, I just got to bring it back around to that because it's just such a crazy idea.
It is.
Um,
It is hilariously. It is a hilarious idea. Honestly, I really wish that the Russell Crowe Noah movie had that in it because it would have been hilarious
right
and
at the
amazing.
climax, a big like T-Rex attacks the Ark. Yes.
Yes, that would have been fantastic. Oh, anyway. Um, so yeah, and part of that comes from one of the founders of Seventh Day Adventism, probably the one who is most important in modern Seventh Day Adventism, Ellen White. She referred to these amalgams or amalgamations, which was this sort of 18th century idea, or I should say, yeah, 19th, early 20th century idea that um, that was like, you put wolf blood in a human and he turns into a werewolf kind of thing.
Yeah, which, by the way, guys, spoiler alerts, that doesn't work. That just causes really bad immune problems for the human.
Which is sad because I've taken my third COVID shot and I still haven't started growing any scales or turning into a crocodile like the one Brazilian president thinks.
Goodness.
I'm disappointed. I want to be part crocodile. I want their immune system for one thing.
I mean, it would be cool. Yeah, being part crocodile. I feel like being a dinosaur, I'm covered. I don't really need to be part crocodile, but
I mean, you are an archosaur, so you're pretty closely related, and you do have a lot of the same immune stuff. Like
exactly.
your immune system is slower, but much more effective than our mammalian one. Like if unless it's much harder for an infection to become systemic with you guys.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sepsis is not much of a thing for archosaurs.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
what
and
is it that first started to clue you in that not only was evolution not the straw man that you had been seeing, but that maybe it was actually true, and maybe this young Earth creationism stuff was not true?
oh, well, this is the interesting part. Um, Shortly after I started attending the Adventist college in Washington, my 15-year-old cousin committed suicide. It was devastating to everybody. Um, and um, that was the point at which the philosophical problem of evil became very real to me.
Yeah.
Um, and it wasn't so much of a how could God allow this to happen to me, but I had suddenly become aware of the immense magnitude of suffering that was possible. Um, you know, this was in 2010, so the 2004 or six tsunami, the Boxing Day tsunami, was still very fresh in my mind. Um, so I was thinking of like the parents who were forced to decide which child they would let go of, because they couldn't hold on to both of them, that kind of thing. And I was like, there's no way that a good God would let that happen. Like, I'm sorry, but like, uh, with great power comes great responsibility. There's no way that a God with even finite morality, that we would still uh, that we would still describe as being good, would just sit there and watch that happen and not do anything. Um, and that started me down a road of doubting everything that I believed. Um, it took a very long time. My deconversion process took about 2 years. Um, I basically tore down my entire worldview and rebuilt it from the ground up.
Okay.
Um, for a while, I wasn't even sure that other people were real or that there was an external world. Um, that's how much it messed with my head. Um, During that period, there was a time when I thought that God existed, but that He was evil, which is a position known as misotheism.
Hmm.
Well, and and that was extremely unpleasant because obviously I'm going to hell and there's nothing I can do to stop it, um, which is really awful to think about. It's not a good place to be on an emotional level. But eventually, um, I started to come out of that. Um, and and at that point where I had realized that okay, the things that I've been taught about God are not true. Maybe there's other things. that I was taught that are also not true. That's the point at which I started to look into evolution.
Okay.
Um, and um, I started with a lot of the classic YouTube channels. So I don't think I know I didn't start with Aaron Ra or Thunderfoot with Foundational Falsehoods of Creationism or Why Do People Laugh at Creationists, but it was a lot of their contemporaries at that time that I started watching, that I started just looking into a little bit here and there, sort of testing the waters. Um, and Potholer 54 was very influential for me because he went through and debunked a lot of the ideas that I'd had, and his explanation, I think it's the video "How to Confuse a Creationist," where he talks about ring species, was the thing that finally did it for me. Um, when I grew up in young Earth creationism, this talk of kinds really wasn't as much of a thing as it is today.
Hmm.
Um, Creationists had not started to accept natural selection and speciation as being possible. I thought that Noah literally had species on the ark.
Yeah.
Um,
He's got 2 coyotes, 2 wolves, 2 jackals.
exactly, exactly. Um, I accepted that dogs were descended from wolves because that seemed, selective breeding of a wolf population into dogs seemed reasonable to me.
Hmm.
Um, you know, uh, and doing that within the 4,000 years roughly doesn't seem it didn't seem impossible to me. You know, that wasn't so bad. Um, but like but the idea that a coyote and a wolf had a common ancestor, that I didn't think was accurate at all. Um, so when the concept of ring species showed up to me, when I saw Kent Hovind, who I'd never heard of until I started leaving creationism, I'd never heard of Kent Hovind or Ken Ham, um, because I lived in this little Adventist bubble, and they didn't. Uh, they had their own preachers.
Hmm.
Um,
Did you know who
but
Arthur Chadwick was or is?
no, I don't. I don't think I've even heard of him.
He's a professor at Loma Linda University. That's why I ask, because Loma Linda is a Seventh
Oh,
Day
okay, okay.
Adventist
Yeah,
university.
yeah. I'd not heard of him, but I have heard of Loma Linda, definitely.
Okay.
Um, yeah. I was more watching like Doug Batchelor. I don't know if you've heard of him,
Does not
but
actually ring a bell. I'll have to
he is.
check into it.
Yeah, he doesn't have a very big YouTube presence. There's an old video of him trying to debunk evolution, and it's absolutely terrible and hilarious. Um, I'll have to send you a link to it,
Please do.
or at least a debunking of it, because I know I've seen it. I know I've seen it done. Um, but he was one of the guys that I listened to, and he was the founder and I'm not sure if he's still in charge of Amazing Facts, but the same organization that put out that Creationist comic book.
Okay.
Uh,
Okay.
yeah, and they're sort of one of the more scientific wings uh, of Seventh Day Adventism. They're called Amazing Facts because they look for amazing facts in the world and try to relate it back uh, to Christianity.
I gotta say, if they're
Uh,
the more scientific branch, I shudder to think of the less scientific branch.
well, most of the less scientific branches don't even really look at that. They're looking at other theological things like how rock music is evil.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah.
um,
I mean, obviously it is. Clearly.
yeah, yeah, and Harry Potter and Dungeons and Dragons, those kinds of things. Um, yeah. Um, anyway, but seeing Kent Hovind express these arguments that I'd heard all my life, um, and then accept um, that like Minnesota and Florida rabbits can interbreed, but Alaska rabbits and Florida rabbits cannot. Um, but Alaska rabbits can also interbreed with Minnesota rabbits. That that's an open-ended ring species, and
Hmm.
I and finding out that like Ensitinas and greenish warblers have similar things, though of course Ensitinas do have a little bit of interbreeding at the ends.
Yeah.
Uh, but I realized all you have to do is knock out the middle.
Right.
All you have to do is knock out the middle of a ring species, and suddenly you have two species by
Yep.
the biological species concept, which I thought was the biblical definition of a kind. If they can bring forth, then they're the same kind. Which was, it's right there in Genesis. um, so that was the point at which I was like, oh, well, evolution happens then. It has to. Like we have species today that they're one species, but they could be two, and that really opened my eyes. And at that point, I was hooked. I was watching all sorts of videos trying to understand evolution. Um, I don't know if you've heard of Zog from Beetlejuice. He's
Um, I've heard the name, I think.
really
Anyway.
old, really old channel. About to make a comeback actually, but um, he does these very cute videos on evolution and sociology and things like that from the perspective of an alien looking at Earth. And there are some jokes in there like why all why all DNA on Earth has the phrase "squids are stupid" encoded in it. um, that kind of thing, which obviously isn't true.
No.
It's a joke, but he basically is looking at Earth um, from the perspective of like an alien observer and explaining all of the things that people and animals do from that perspective, and explaining evolution, and that was really fun. And eventually I got into other things, and it's just become a passion of mine. Just watching young Earth creationism debunks is just a very fun little hobby of mine. And
I
then
enjoy making them.
I enjoy watching them. I've been enjoying your series with Gutsick Gibbon and uh, it's not Professor Dave. Creation Myths.
Yes. That's
Yes,
Dan Stern Cardinal, Dr. Dan Stern Cardinal.
that's right. I've been enjoying that series.
By the
I
way,
mean,
last episode should be coming or not tomorrow, sorry, next week on Gutsick Gibbon's channel. So, our final
awesome.
wrap up. There you go.
I am excited. um, uh, but um, but just that sort of thing. I've learned a lot from watching Young Earth Creationism debunked, because one thing that Young Earth Creationists are great at doing is asking good questions.
Mhm.
They just aren't very good at accepting the answers. Um, like, if there are like even the dumb questions, like if we come from monkeys, why are there still monkeys? Is a good question if asked by a 5-year-old just trying to understand evolution. And if you then listen
Right.
to the explanation and accept the answer, you know, then it's good. And honestly, it was never an argument that I had heard before I heard it debunked, but learning the answer to why that's not a very good question can actually teach you a lot about how evolution works and cladistics and taxonomy and that kind of thing. Um, and uh, and that sort of thing, it just really sparked my passion for it, and I absolutely love evolution. I tried going back to college, but due to my health problems, I haven't actually managed to finish my bachelor's degree. But I took an evolution course, and it was absolutely fascinating. Um, just looking at it, and I was very much ahead of the curve on it because of all the YouTube videos that I had watched. Um, uh, that really famous demonstration of Dawkins building an eye,
Yep.
that was huge for me, because of course the eye argument was one that I had used myself.
Right.
An eye is too complex to evolve. But then he built one in front of me.
Yeah,
Like,
and in a way that every step was both not the kind of thing that you would think is a radical jump, but also selectively advantageous.
yeah, like the only thing that would have been dubious to me as a creationist was the idea of a light sensing patch of cells. Like, the origin of that was the only thing that needs a little bit of hand wavium, because I didn't realize that, like, sensing light is something that most cells do on some level. Like, even if it's infrared with heat, that kind of thing. Um, and I also recently discovered that octopi can see color with their skin, which is weird and amazing. Octopodes?
You know what? The plural for octopus is much debated, and I just go with, you know what, man, just pick one. It's fine. I don't care.
Yeah. Or is it octopodes?
No, I don't think it's that.
Anyway, um, but yes, that kind of thing. Really fascinating. But at the time, I wouldn't have. That would have been the only thing. But once you've got that, you've got an eye. And eh, and the fact that, like, flatworms have these basic light sensing patches on the tops of their heads, yeah, that that was enough for me to be like, okay, yeah, and I can evolve from just that.
Hmm.
um, which is uh, which was mind blowing for me at the time. Um, Leaving young Earth creationism was difficult for me, though, on an emotional level. Not so much the young Earth creationism part, but leaving the Christianity and the indoctrination, and letting go of the idea that there was this benevolent divine figure looking out for me that I could pray to, that kind of thing. Um, and just sort of that whole process of reshaping my worldview from the
Yeah.
ground up. Very difficult. Um, uh, it was uh, it took me to some very dark places in terms of my mental health. Um, Including, like, my first, what I call, a black mood as opposed to a gray mood. Um, anyone who's had depression will probably kind of get what I'm talking about. Where there's sort of a gray mood where you're just sort of blah and you don't feel anything, and then there's a black mood where you're like, I hate everything. Well, it's not even a hatred exactly. It's just like this general gloom that is almost tangible. Um, it's it's really hard to describe. Um, but um, but part of uh, part of the process of losing my cousin, and then of having all of these doubts and trying to figure out what was real and what wasn't, was just a huge strain on my psyche. And eventually I broke. Um, uh, I was, I think, doing dishes, doing something in my kitchen at some point. Um, and suddenly I collapsed on the floor, um, and I couldn't get back up. Um, I called campus security for some help. They called an ambulance, um, and they gave me some juice and stuff, and got me. And after a few minutes, I was fine. But then over the next few months, that sort of thing started happening more and more frequently and for longer periods, until um, I lost the ability to walk entirely, um, for months. I had to drop out of school. Um, I went to neurologists and ended up in a psych ward, of a hospital in New York, which was awful. Fortunately, not all psych wards are like prisons, but that one was. Um, and and eventually they came to the conclusion that I have a somatic problem. Basically, my brain will shut down my body if I am too stressed out. Um, I get fatigue. I get dizziness. I get weakness in my legs. Um, and it's a constant and intermittent problem for me now that I just kind of have to live with. Um, the only way to manage it is to manage my mental health, um, which I do the best I can. Um, when I was a when I was a creationist, I was uh, nervous about medication. Um, I was afraid that it would make me a different person, and I had this idea that I should just be able to get better with God's help. I don't need all uh, these pills and chemicals. You know.
Now, is rejecting medical intervention in favor of hopeful miraculous cures a common thing for Seventh Day Adventism, or is that more of a individual thing?
It's more of an individual thing. Seventh Day Adventists do run a lot of hospitals.
Hmm.
Um, you mentioned Loma Linda, and that's actually one of the bigger medical teaching facilities um, in Seventh Day Adventism. Um, um, but when it comes to mental health, is where people are a little bit shakier um, because, well, they hold a lot of the same societal uh, misconceptions about mental health that a lot of people do, where it's all in your head. You should just be able to think better and get better, or they think of it as a some kind of moral failing. You're not trusting God enough, that kind of thing. Um, and not saying that that's all Adventist by any stretch. One thing that I learned by moving from the East Coast to the West Coast is that Seventh Day Adventism is a lot more diverse than I thought it was. Um, and there are a lot more liberal and less fundamentalist Adventists than I realized at the time. Um, but uh, but still, there's definitely a strong strain of that within Seventh Day Adventism.
Okay. Well, I asked because first I don't know firsthand exactly what the attitudes are, but
Hmm.
I'm glad that at least outside of mental health that there's a strong push towards like no, medicine is a good thing. Run hospitals, teach people medical stuff, so that's good. But mental health, I think it comes back to um not
Yeah,
seeing the
mental health
brain as
and
an
reproductive.
organ.
Sorry.
I was gonna say, not seeing like the mind as a product of the brain, which is an organ, which itself can have medical problems.
Yep.
And it's very easy when you get into the idea that, well, your mind doesn't really come from your brain. It comes from
Hmm.
something spiritual, and then therefore spiritual remedies are what you need for mental health problems.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
guys, the brain's an organ. You should treat it as such. And problems with mental health are often problems with brain function that require medical intervention.
Absolutely. I currently work as a peer specialist. I don't know if you know what that is, but it's kind of a new profession in the medical field, in the mental health field, where it's people who have been through uh, who have a lived experience of mental health and mental health treatment, who are helping other people to navigate that uh, that whole experience uh, for the first time. So we kind of have a walk alongside instead of a leading you kind of attitude, um, where the goal is to make that human connection and say, I've been in a similar place to where you've been. Um, I know what it's like to feel depression or to have psychosis or um, to to have these kinds of symptoms. I know what it's like to be nervous about taking medication. Will it make me a different person? Will it turn me into a zombie? And to help people to figure out what it is that they want from treatment, and to communicate that to their prescribers, their therapists, that kind of thing. Um, I think it's very valuable work. I think it's something that I'm happy to see that it's spreading pretty rapidly across the United States and the world, but it is still fairly new and not very well known or understood, or appreciated even by certain medical professionals. Um, but it's um, something that the data that we have has been very encouraging in terms of outcomes, um, and I think that it also helps to fight some of the pseudoscience and woo stuff. Um, like if you go to a homeopathic practitioner, they'll often do a lot of that more human connection kind of stuff, that you don't get from your more clinical settings. And so people often feel like that's better, like they're getting better, and I think that peer specialists can kind of fill that gap and fulfill that need that people have to feel like they're seen uh, and being treated like a human being instead of just a list of symptoms.
Yeah.
Um, and so I definitely think that it's a valuable uh, effort in that term in those terms. Sorry.
Okay.
So anyway, sorry, that was a bit of a tangent, but
No, it was an important one. So,
yeah. Um,
let's to bring it back.
mhm.
So, how do you feel now about the sort of the sources that you had for your creationist information? Because you talked about how you realized that, hey, a lot of the things they were saying about evolution were just really absurd straw man versions of evolution, and that some of the things that they were saying just weren't true. So, did you feel like betrayed or lied to?
Yeah, definitely. Especially early on, there was definitely a feeling of I have been lied to. Um, I have been deceived. Um, as I got over the original emotional shock, um,
Hmm.
my attitudes have changed a bit. Um, I think that most of the people in the pews, and even a lot of the pastors that are spewing this stuff, don't know how wrong they are. They do not have the kind of training, to differentiate the difference to differentiate between um, someone who is just feeding them a line, but either has uh, either has a fancy title or just is very charismatic, um, and someone who actually has expertise in the field.
Yeah.
They simply don't know how to tell the difference. To them, it's just someone standing at a podium and talking, and it's just whoever you believe is whoever has the worldview that you accept. Um, but I think the people at the top, the people who are generating these arguments, the people who are um, putting effort into this, the people like AIG, the people like the Discovery Institute, those people are deliberately lying. They have to be. They know better. Like Georgia Purdom is a geneticist. She has gone through um, a PhD, where she has learned why all of her arguments are wrong. Um,
Right.
like I learned how all of her arguments are wrong. Well, not all of them, but how a lot of them are wrong in an intro class at the undergraduate level. That's how wrong these people are.
Yeah,
Um,
generally speaking, if you've been through under like freshman level undergraduate classes in the aspects that young Earth creationism tends to teach on, you will know why they are wrong.
yeah,
General rule of thumb. It doesn't take much more than a single year of some STEM classes in
uh,
undergrad.
yeah, exactly. I mean, it's really not something that it takes very much training to know that you're wrong about. Um, I Interestingly, the college that I went to, the Adventist college, they are accredited. They do teach evolution, which is one reason Ken Ham doesn't like Seventh Day Adventists.
Hmm.
Um, Uh, but and I only heard this from a fellow student. This is secondhand information. Um, but apparently, what they will do is they will teach you legitimate evolution, but then they will also teach you arguments against it alongside of alongside of the actual genuine information.
I mean, that's
And
at least a step up from not teaching it at all.
oh yeah, definitely, absolutely. And they have to do that in order to be accredited.
Right.
And so they are giving actual genuine information, at least in the particular school that I was going to. I can't speak for the rest, but uh, and I can't speak for the quality even at that school because I didn't take the class. I really wish I had though, because to be a fly on the wall in that class. Yeah, I expect it's more of the ID level stuff than the young Earth creation stuff at that point, but that's just my guess.
Okay.
Because it's a little bit harder to debunk Michael Behe's flagellar motor kind of stuff um, than it is to debunk the eye not evolving,
Yeah.
because you actually have to know a little bit about biochem, which
Although
is
it was fun that when Michael Behe was testifying in favor of intelligent design, and when he said that there was no research done on the evolution of such things, that he was then presented with a very large stack of printed out scientific papers and asked if he
yes,
was aware of these, and he said that he was not. And then he was asked, well, then how did you come to the conclusion that there was no research? And he didn't really
yes,
have a good answer for that.
yes. Actually, the Nova special came out at about the same time that I was finishing up my deconversion, and it was fantastic. Like, just the timing of that was perfect for me.
Yeah.
um,
Now,
because
I'll say, I
yeah,
don't have anything personal against Dr. Behe. I've only talked to him once, but he was a nice guy. But I also don't think that he had very good answers for my questions when I talked to him. So,
yeah. No, I don't think that Dr. Behe, or I think it's William Dembski that does the specified complexity. I don't think that they're being honest either. Um,
yeah, it's for me, it's a little hard to say because they're not as obviously wrong as say like Ken Ham, but also
mhm.
I'm just like, you guys got to know that this is not. Like, you're smart guys. You got to
Yeah,
know that this doesn't work.
exactly. Yeah, no, and it's not just that, but like these are people who have been trained in academic skepticism, in the scientific method, in what a good hypothesis looks like. Um, and their hypotheses don't look like good hypotheses.
Yeah,
Um, whether they are lying intentionally or whether it's just like bias overtaking their rational thoughts doesn't really matter to me at this point, because they have the training and the experience to know better.
okay,
Like, these are people um who are deliberately setting aside the same kind of skepticism that they know how to use uh for other claims on their personal pet claims. And in my mind, they are as much dishonest as like the band camp, the birds are not dinosaurs people.
yep. My goodness. Which, by the way, I love how much it makes them squirm that creationists love the bandits, because my goodness, do they hate that? And it's like, well, you guys are on about the same level, so I don't know what you're complaining about. Mr. Deinonychus is just a flightless bird.
Hmm. Yeah.
So I do want to ask. Well, first, I'm going to ask a question, but I do want to let people know that we are getting up to when we're going to start the Q&A session. The Q&A session, usually I let it go for up to a half an hour. It depends on, how frequently we get questions and how many questions we get. The way that is going to work is if you do bother to super chat, that first, thank you. And second, that will put your question to the top of the line. So only when I'm through with any super chat questions that might have come in will I then go to other questions. If you don't super chat, please do tag at Dapper Dinosaur so that I can make sure that I notice it, because quite frankly, there's a big long chat log, and if it doesn't have a tag on it, there's a very good chance that my eyes are going to skip over it. Now, I will try to look for other things that don't have me tagged. There's still questions, so I mean, if you don't tag me, it's not a guarantee that I won't, but it'll be much less likely that I'll notice the question. So get your questions ready. And I mean, you can super chat at any time because I'll collect those. But if you're not going to super chat, do hold the questions till the end, so that way they all kind of come in around the time where I'm looking for them. So that's how that's going to happen. That's going to come up probably, 5 to 15 minutes, depending. So I think the last big question I want to ask before we jump into Q&A is, what effect has this had on your relationships with people who are in your life who are still young Earth creationists, like church friends, family, things like that?
Yeah, so that's actually really interesting. And my answer is that it is very different depending on the individual. My mom and I got into a very big fight. She uh, she said that I was demon possessed, that she should have aborted me, and dared me to kill myself because of my depression. Um,
Yikes.
and I in turn told her that she was a terrible mother. um,
No, I think that would be fair. Normally, I wouldn't support people saying that to their moms, but after her saying that, no, that seems fair.
um, we are. Since then, things have calmed down a little bit. I have moved out of the house, and my mother is always nicer to me when I am outside of the house than when I am in it. Um, and uh, but things are still strained, and if I was not functionally disabled and in constant need of help, I would probably, and also wanting to stay in contact with my other family members, I would have probably cut her out of my life by this point. Um, I would like to do that. I just kind of can't. Um, my dad, on the other hand, has been very understanding and supportive. He doesn't agree with me, but he has made it very clear that he will love me and support me, um, no matter what. He has been much more open to like listening to what I actually have to say instead of cutting me off and straw manning me constantly, like my mother does whenever we have any kind of religious or scientific discussion kind of things. Um, he, he has been fantastic, and I honestly think that that his approach has been wonderful. Um, my other family members have responded in various ways along that spectrum, but for the most part, people are still, um, they're still there for me. I have not been totally disowned. I have not been kicked out of the house. That kind of thing. I've not been disinvited because I'm an atheist. Um, and people are not constantly trying to preach to me either.
Okay.
Again, mostly it's my mother, and only once in a while. I showed her button quail, and she was like, "How could that have evolved?" Button quail, by the way, everyone should look them up. They're adorable. They're ridiculously tiny.
Hence the name.
Yes, yes. Like you can fit a baby button quail in a spoon.
Yeah.
Anyway, distant relatives of yours, I believe.
Yes, well, fairly distant. I mean, we're probably talking like more distant than the, humans and kangaroos, but still, technically.
um, it's kind of strange how very different you guys can be, and yet have so much underlying anatomic similarity to them. in
To
terms
be
of
fair,
my,
you have a lot of underlying anatomic similarity to a kangaroo.
we do. And ironically, we're both bipeds convergently, which is very
Yes.
strange.
But yeah, like people are like, oh look, how could those dinosaurs be so distantly related? It's like, I think you overestimate how diverse mammals are because you are one.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It, it's I definitely agree. I mean, at least you and the button quail have like the same posture, and it's homologous.
True.
um, but like, you know, I don't know exactly how much ceratosaurs weigh. um, but button quail are a lot less than that.
Yes.
They don't they don't have teeth. They don't have the long tails. They have the pygostyles. That kind of thing.
So,
Um,
I think we should probably start working on wrapping up towards Q&A. So what I'll say is, guys, now that we're going to be starting the Q&A, I will start making sure that I look for the questions tagged. And remember, of course, and super chat is certainly not a requirement. This is not a channel where if you want to have your question answered, you have to super chat. It just does help the channel, and of course, you do get bumped up to the front of the list. So, I did see a question earlier that was, what is your favorite hominid? I think it said hominid.
ooh, my favorite hominid. Um, that is a very difficult question. Obviously, I'm biased in favor of humans specifically, but Homo sapiens. Um, but I also I really like gibbons. I really like orangutans. I really like Neanderthals. Um,
Well,
honestly,
technically, gibbons aren't hominids, so.
oh, they aren't. They're hominoids, aren't they?
Mhm.
Sorry. The I always get those levels mixed up. I know
Yeah,
that hominins are like Australopithecines and closer to us, but
yeah,
um,
it's confusing to have hominoid, hominid, and hominin all as different taxa.
yeah. To be fair, the same thing happens with tyrannosaurs.
True,
Um,
Tyrannosauridia, Tyrannosauridae, Tyrannosaurines. Yeah.
yeah, and then Tyrannosaurus.
Well, yes, which is
um,
a Tyrannosaurine, Tyrannosaurid, Tyrannosauroid. Yay for science!
oh, I'm not sure who's worse at naming things, scientists or historians.
Both. The answer is both.
Oh, anyway, I think maybe I will go with Neanderthals simply because I am part Neanderthal. Uh, I even have I'm even carrying a red hair gene, which I think maybe came from them.
Okay.
Um, I don't know for sure that red hair came from Neanderthals, but I know um, that there's a strong correlation between Neanderthal DNA and red hair. So maybe, um, but they were very cool hominins, and I am sad that they have gone extinct.
Yeah.
um, you know,
By the way, my Atkinson says thoroughly confused now. Okay, thanks, guys. I'm sorry.
sorry.
So our first super chat question has just come in from Don Chan, who for $10 US says, "Wouldn't the fact that creationists will lie, misrepresent their views, cause more of the younger generation to leave? Do they even realize that? Since access to information is so widely available."
From what I understand, this is actually happening. Um, the general trend, from my understanding, is that people are leaving organized religion a lot more. Um, there's the phenomenon known as the rise of the nuns,
Mhm.
um, and this does seem to be a cohort effect, in that as you get older, you tend to stay less religious. Um, the same thing happens in the political arena, where you tend to be less conservative the younger you are, and it also travels with you as you get older. Um, so um, so there is some hope there, and one thing that has really helped for young people leaving, I think, has been the rise of the internet and the access of information, um, and it's a lot easier to check claims. Um, Even though the rise of the internet has also meant the rise of disinformation and like conspiracy theories. Um, kids that grow up as digital natives tend to be really, they have to get good at picking out the the lies and the misrepresentations,
Yeah.
because we're raised knowing that you can't trust what's on the internet.
Right.
And you can't trust everything that you read on the internet, and so you have to learn how to exercise skepticism. And I think that that is contributing to people leaving. Um, it's not a uniform thing, and it's not it's definitely not perfect. There's also a corresponding rise of extremism happening, um, but I think that the fact that young Earth creationists are discrediting themselves, um, is leading young people away. The younger people in my family are also the ones who tend to be leaving Adventism for either just sort of a more moderate Christianity, or or leaving it altogether.
Yeah. And I tend to agree. I think it's like my bit of advice. If your goal is to see Christianity grow and remain a, intellectual force in the future, um, insisting on young Earth creationism is not doing it any favors.
Well,
Um,
and
yeah,
something that I've learned from my experience, my personal experience, is that young Earth creationism relies on isolating people from facts, especially during their formative years. Um, there's a reason why there is so much effort put into homeschooling and private school curriculums and things like that, um, because they know that kids haven't developed those skeptical faculties yet, and they don't want them to develop them.
yeah,
And I have observed this with myself. I have observed this with my younger siblings. That uh, the reason why, going back um, to uh, to VeggieTales, the reason why there's all this alternative Christian media, and the reason why things like Harry Potter and Dungeons and Dragons are discouraged, is to keep the kids away from anything, any kind of influence that might cause them to doubt their beliefs. Um, I think that there is, at least on the subconscious level, an understanding that their beliefs cannot stand up to scrutiny. Which is why they don't want. That's why there's all these alternatives to the world,
okay.
and why it's possible to grow up in that Christian bubble.
Icarus asks, do you still do computer programming?
Very rarely. I have done a little bit here and there. I will occasionally do a little Python programming here and there, or something like that. I'll get the itch once in a while, but sadly, I just don't have it anymore. I don't know what happened, but my passion for it just sort of disappeared. I'm very glad that I learned it. I think that learning computer programming was also a step that led me out of young Earth creationism, because it taught me how to evaluate things logically, um, and there's that sort of programming style of thinking that requires you to break a problem down into its simplest components and then rebuild it, and then build the solution from those. That is very useful. I really think that we should be teaching kids programming for that reason, because the problem solving that you learn from computer programming can be generalized to all aspects of life. Um, but sadly, I don't do as much of it anymore as I used to. Now I do a lot more art and writing.
Okay. Let's see. An intrigued feline, and this isn't a question, but it is a
Mhm.
statement that's directed to you. If you like to read books, there is a great book series by John M. Auel, I think, Auel, called The Earth Children, with the first book being Clan of the Cave Bear, it focuses on Neanderthals, which I've read that book. I quite enjoyed it.
I will have to see if it is on Audible. I prefer audiobooks, if I can get them. But that sounds very interesting. I am gonna write that down. What was the name of that again?
Clan of the Cave Bear.
By
Jean, Gean, M. All, I think. Auel, I'm not really
Auel.
sure.
Auel.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep. I have not read any of the other books in the series, but I did read Clan of the Cave Bear. I think I read it for school. But it was
Interesting.
definitely like a kid when I read it. So, I mean, by kid, I mean like I was in high school, right? I wasn't like 8.
Right.
I actually don't think it's terribly appropriate for an 8-year-old, but for like a 15, 16-year-old, it's fine.
Yeah. Yeah.
So let's see. I'm gonna double check to
Sounds
see if
like
I've
a
missed
bit
any.
of a more grown-up version of the Croods.
Significantly more grown up. Yeah, it's much more adult in terms of many of the topics that it covers.
I would imagine so.
Yeah. All right. So I'm double checking to see if I haven't missed anything. Missed. So apparently it is on Audible, so that's good.
Okay, that's awesome.
And there are a number of people who are discussing which scripting language is best, and also endorsing the book. Which actually, there you go. You get only one. Which scripting language is best?
Oh, a scripting language.
Or just go with any kind of programming language. Just any programming language. Which one's your favorite?
All right, so that's always a tough question because there are so many pros and cons. It's kind of like picking your best Pokemon, or it's kind of like picking the best Pokemon, or your the best tabletop role playing game. But I think my favorite to program in is probably probably Python, but with a caveat that I really don't like that variables don't need to be declared ahead of time in that language. I um, I very much prefer that I have to uh, explicitly declare my variables before I use them, so that I don't run into bugs where the program compiles but doesn't do what I expect it to do. I mean, that still happens, but you know.
Yeah.
Um,
Okay.
I used to use a programming language called Basic 4GL, but it's long since gone defunct by now. I programmed a few games for that in high school.
Okay. What about your least favorite programming language?
Ooh, least favorite. Um, least favorite.
Tough one.
Yeah. Um, that is a tough one because a lot of the really bad ones, like COBOL, I haven't used, so I can't speak to them specifically. But
How about
I th-
Malbolge? Are you familiar with that one?
I've not heard of that one.
So, Malbolge is a programming language that was developed in the late 90s. And the name is a reference to the Eighth Circle of Hell from Dante's Inferno, because it is intentionally obtuse and virtually impossible to use. And if I remember correctly, it took something like a decade for someone to actually get a program to compile in a Malbolge that just said "Hello World."
Oh.
But like it was intentionally created to be impossible to program in. And so,
Oh,
like,
goodness.
it technically it works. You can actually program in Malbolge, but like there's no good reason to ever do so other than to be like, "Hey guys, I got this to work."
Wow.
So yeah, it's
I think I have an answer. My least favorite programming language that I've actually used is C#.
okay.
Um, I like C++, but C#, that whole I'm specifically talking about like the Visual Studio 2005 kind of C sharp. Um, Back when it was basically impossible to do much of anything because Microsoft had decided that they were going to rewrite all of the programming languages and make nothing backward compatible. Um, yeah, I no, no, thank you. um, I have written like a Hello World program in C sharp, and I did not like it. So
I mean, it's not a bad like test. Like, okay, new programming language. I'm just gonna get something that prints "Hello World." How much of a pain in the butt is that gonna be? And
yeah, and I mean C++ is bad, but at least the overhead is basically constant. You're always importing the same stuff. You're always opening main, that kind of thing. And once you've learned, oh, I basically just always copy and paste this stuff into the beginning of the program, you don't have to think about it anymore.
yeah,
Um, but
for £5 British, Mike Brooks asks. There you go. I can say words. Is the problem with Christianity that so many pastors and priests are so poorly educated compared in the past when many scientists were also priests?
okay, so that's another interesting question, and it's especially interesting because I studied theology at a Christian school. Um, And one thing that I learned very quickly is that the pastors, at least the ordained ones in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, know a lot more than ever reaches the congregation. Um, so, like they know that the Gospels were authored anonymously, um, that we don't really know who they were, but they were probably not the disciples, um, whose names are attached to them. um, they know that that the word firmament means a solid dome spread over a flat earth, um, that kind of thing, and it never trickles down from their seminary down into their congregations. The and that really bothers me. Um, that even the pastors who are well educated are generally not sharing that education despite having a platform where they talk to people every week. Um, that also feels very dishonest to me. Even though my dad being a pastor, I know that he doesn't remember hardly any of that. um,
Right.
and a lot of what he preaches about is more like morality stuff, how to be nice to other people, and that kind of thing. um, but at the same time, it seems like there's a sort of selective ignorance going on where they're intentionally not telling people these things that could undermine their faith, and they're just sort of towing the party line in terms of, well, this is the doctrine, and we know that the Bible is reliable, and they just sort of leave out or intention or just directly misrepresent the things that they learned. So I don't know if that directly answered the question, but um, but I hope that at least uh, give you an idea of where I stand on that. I think that there is some level of dishonesty in the selection of information that gets shared to the rank and file Christians, who are in the pews.
Okay.
Um,
One thing
and
oh,
and
sorry, go ahead.
yeah, go ahead.
Well, the only thing I was going to add is that that the degree to which that's a problem in Christianity varies significantly depending on which community you're in, and even within
Definitely.
certain churches. So you can find places where there's a strong anti-intellectual bent to the Christianity, and the pastors who've even been to college are looked down upon. And
Hmm.
on the other hand, you can find places like look, the observatory near me still has a lot of its telescopes that are owned and operated by the Vatican.
Wow.
Yeah, like the Vatican's still doing a lot of cutting edge astronomy. So like it varies a lot. But then again, you can also find Catholic priests in like the backwoods who are every bit as crazy and fundamentalist and even creationist as, say, like
Oh yeah,
an
the ones who think
uneducated.
that Vatican II was a mistake.
Right. So like it. It's one of those things where it's like it's hard to give an answer for Christianity as a whole. It's certainly a
Absolutely.
problem with parts of Christianity, but it's less of a problem with other parts. And in some parts, you can actually find some very well educated, very erudite, very intelligent clergymen and lay people. So it's
Yeah, and you can, and I should say, I'm speaking specifically in the context of the of my experience with what is a very fundamentalist version of Christianity, um,
mhm.
in terms of that ignorance getting passed down. Um, in that the pastors are learning these things and then not passing them down. I have seen on occasion some sermons that do actually go into those kinds of things. I don't really understand how you can remain a Christian and yet not and yet acknowledge these problems, but that's that's an entirely different can of worms. Um, and it, it is my experience in general that you know some pastors just aren't educated. In certain denominations, you don't need any qualifications at all, really, to become a pastor, other than you need to be able to speak well. Um, but at least in Adventist churches, to become an ordained pastor, you do have to have a degree, which means that, and I know what they're teaching in those schools, and it's not getting passed down to most congregations.
um, Selena Felicity White asks, Dapper Dinosaur and Andrian, this is I guess for both of us, what do you think of the apocryphal writings such as the Gospel of Peter, etc.?
Um, I've only read a few of them, and mostly the New Testament ones. So I can't really speak to like Maccabees or the Book of Enoch. Um, I think that they're fascinating. Um, I think that they give us a good idea of like the trajectory of Christian thought or Jewish thought um, in in areas outside of the Bible. Um, and they also give us a sense of the diversity of thought that was going on that kind of got stamped out when what is now orthodox became orthodox. um, but I don't think that there's any like additional credence to those as opposed to the Bible, or that they're any less credible for that matter, in general speaking. um, some are obvious hoaxes, and we know that they're hoaxes, um, but we know that for specific books of the Bible as well. So
So, yeah, one of the things is that there is the difference between what's so-called New Testament versus Old Testament Apocrypha. The Old Testament Apocrypha, with the exception of some things like the books of Enoch, are largely just the bits of the Septuagint for which one weren't in the Masoretic text, and two for which there were no known like Hebrew manuscripts. Um, but they were considered to be just part of the Bible by the vast majority of Christianity for most of Christian history. Although there was always a question because we couldn't find Hebrew originals. Since then, there have in fact been some Hebrew originals found. I think for like one of the books of Maccabees. But anyway, the New Testament Apocrypha though it's a sort of a different beast because these books were never really even considered for inclusion for the most part in terms of the New Testament. That's
hmm
primarily because they weren't attested until long after the first and second centuries. Or at the very least, late into the second century for some of the earlier ones. And so they were always kind of considered by most of Christianity as sort of like, these are interesting works, and in some cases they're popular or less popular, but you don't actually even find really much discussion about things like putting Gospel of Peter or Infancy Gospel of James actually into the quote unquote canon, which basically comes down to the books that you read in church, because that's what originally the
Right.
canon was which books will we read in church, as opposed to books that, while we won't read them in the church service, they're fine for people to just read. And so for most of them, there wasn't even really a serious discussion that they would be put in there because they were so late relative to
hmm
the other writings. But there are some books that were floated as potential canonical books that didn't make it in, like the Shepherd of Hermas. But then again, the Shepherd of Hermas is, most of those books, or like the letters of Clement of Alexandria. But the thing is that most of those aren't the fun, interesting ones that have, significantly different teachings than what you find in what ended up in the canon. So
Yeah, I think it was Genetically Modified Skeptic recently did a fantastic book, or a fantastic video on uh, the Acts of Paul and Thecla, I think it was,
yeah.
which was absolutely fascinating. I'm not sure exactly what the writing time of that is, but that seems to be one that was almost intentionally removed from canon, which I also find very fascinating. In that it was extremely popular, and then it was actively discouraged by the orthodoxy.
An intrigued feline says, one last question: what does Andrian think would be the best approach to prevent and/or quote deconvert these young Earth creationists? Is it something fought politically, locally, within circles?
You know, it's hard to say, honestly. Um, I'm very lucky to have gotten out. Um, um, and I have tried in the past to go, to kind of go back and talk people out of it, and it's very difficult. Um, there's and for reasons which I can understand, there is a lot of um, psychology going on, which is designed to keep people in there. Uh, it the obvious things would be like the fear of hell, um, the relationship that you think you have with God, that kind of thing. Um, but then there's also, you have to break through that barrier of disinformation, which is something that we've discovered in like the political arena with like the Q conspiracies and things, is virtually impossible. It's so hard. Um, and I honestly have no idea how to do it. Um, I don't know what the best way to talk someone out of young Earth creationism is. I'm not sure that there is a best way. I know that it can be done. It happened to me, but it really comes down to the person having to value truth above everything else, and to be willing to follow the truth wherever it leads, however uncomfortable. And that's not something that you, as an outsider, can impart on someone else. Um, that said, I think that education programs, specifically for children, are going to be the best way to fight young Earth creationism going forward. Um, we need to not allow unregulated homeschooling, unregulated private schooling. Um, we need to not let we basically need to not let the kind of isolation that I grew up with happen to kids, because if you expose them to different points of view, and the more points of view you expose them to, the more likely they are to develop those skeptical faculties, which will eventually lead them out of the kinds of harmful belief systems, uh, like young Earth creationism, that rely on that kind of isolation. At least that's my perspective on it.
Okay. These aren't questions so much, but they are statements that I'll read off. Celine Felicity White says, the Acts of Paul and Thecla was one I wanted to be included, presumably in the canon. And then she goes on to note that the Acts of Paul and Thecla were dated to about 120 AD to 150, if memory serves me correctly. So it really wasn't in the running for books to be included in the New Testament canon. Although those dates are reasonable, apparently the earliest that we have record of the work existing is from about 190, which meant that it probably existed for a while before that, so that it could actually be included in any discussion. And while it was popular in a lot of places, because it was known to be a second century work and not a first century work.
Right.
Now, of course, these exact centuries weren't being used by people at the time, but basically, no one thought of it as being a work that was contemporaneous to the actual to anyone who actually experienced any events from the New Testament. Because while it is the case that pretty much all of the New Testament is pseudo-anonymous, that's the word I'm looking for. It was, however, very, very early, and was probably written within the tail end of living memory of the times described, whereas this one was known not to be.
Yeah, with a few possible exceptions, like maybe Hebrews, which I don't know well enough, but I know that that's one of the later. I know that that's one of the later books attributed to Paul that Paul almost certainly did not write. So,
although I bet Kent might think that the Hebrews wrote it, since he thinks that Timothy wrote the books of 1st and 2nd Timothy.
Oh.
Did I just break your brain just a little bit?
Yes.
Yeah. Spoiler alert to everybody. The books of 1st and 2nd Timothy are so titled because they were addressed to Timothy, not because they were written by Timothy.
And you would know that if you had read the first verse.
Yeah, of each book. The first verse of each book is an address from Paul to Timothy. So
yes,
even though there's controversy about the Pauline authorship, they certainly don't even claim to be authored by the Timothy of the title.
No, why would you? Like, okay, so this is something that that has bugged me even when I was a young Earth creationist, is the amount of biblical ignorance among professing Christians. But for this to be from Kent Hovind?
Yep.
Really?
Mm-hmm. He says it all the time, and it bugs me every single time.
I don't watch a lot of his newer stuff. For obvious reasons, I cannot afford to lose that many brain cells.
No, it's fine.
But but the fact that that is happening. Oh.
Yeah, it's baffling. I don't get it, and apparently no one ever corrects him on this.
Like you would think that if you're going to pontificate on what the Bible says, you would have at least read most of it. Like, I haven't read all of the Bible, but that's mostly because certain parts of it are really are either really boring or really confusing. I once tried to read straight through the Bible. I think I made it to like 2nd Chronicles, maybe.
That's pretty far.
There, well, it is, but I most of it was just so mind numbing that that it just sort of washed over me. I was reading the words, but they weren't going through my brain. Like, like I think it's the first 7 chapters of 1st Chronicles is nothing but genealogy.
Yeah,
it's terrible. Like,
well,
but still, yeah, you would think that he would at least read the New Testament.
Yeah, and have the most basic idea about what's in there. Yeah, you would think. But so we're gonna start wrapping up, guys. So I want to say first, thank you to everyone who came. I really appreciate it. A special thank you to Don John and Mike Brooks, who super chatted questions. Every little bit helps, guys, because it really does add up. And I want to say once again, we are still doing the Patreon drive again, because it's the 2nd of the month, and Patreon always takes like about a week or so to settle out in terms of like how many active patrons I still have and who gets their payments in after the fact and whatnot. I'm not exactly sure how close we are to the goal. The goal again is $400 a month, but we're probably around $50 away from that. And I just want to read Evidence of Reason. Sal Cordova says that he thought of me today as he learned of a church father named Papias. I'm studying his eschatology, and I'm connecting YEC to Revelation chapter 6. Yeah, Papias, he was apparently a very prolific author. Unfortunately, none of his works actually survive in any kind of like whole. And so all we have are what are called the fragments of Papias. And while he wrote in Greek, Many of our surviving fragments aren't even actually in Greek. Some of them are in Syriac, Arabic, Georgian. So it's sort of unfortunate because apparently he was very popular and was widely cited, but his works only survive in terms of citations of other people, and oftentimes, like I said, in translation. So it's he's a fascinating but very hard to study figure from early Christian history.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just actually turned to the fragments of Papias in my Apostolic Fathers copy, and most of them are in Greek, but yeah, there's some in like all sorts of Latin in some of them, some of the cases, Greek. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Some of those early figures who we only know because other people quoted them,
Yeah.
like Celsus. I don't know how to pronounce it. Who we only know because one of the early church fathers, I can't remember who, wrote a rebuttal to him.
That's actually often the case for the quote unquote heretics of Christianity. Is their actual writings don't survive, and all we have to go on is the claims of their opponents. And how accurate are those? It's a good question.
Yeah, yeah, and I saw someone, Selena Felicity White said that she was a religious sister and never read the whole Bible through until after she stopped being a religious sister. I applaud you for being able to do it. Certain books like Isaiah and Jeremiah are so confusing. You really have to know a lot of the historical context and cross-reference them with like Kings and Chronicles to even understand what's going on in those books. And I never got there, but goodness, good on you. um,
It's certainly not an easy task.
and
It's very long.
no, it is a very long book, and it is not well written in most places. Um, there are some well written parts, but mostly it's not. Um, and I think that it's very sad that a lot of Christians haven't read their Bibles. I knew my Bible extremely well as a Christian. I didn't, I hadn't read the whole thing, but I had read like the entirety of the New Testament. I knew all the stories, or at least all of the interesting stories. Um, I could quote significant portions of it. I grew up steeped in the stuff, and so it seems to me, and it always has, that if you're going to base your life on something, you should at least know what is in it.
Yeah.
If you're going to base your life on this book, you should know what it says. So
All right. Well, I think we're gonna wrap it up. We just hit the 2 hour mark in terms of how long we've been live on YouTube. So, Andrian, thank you very much. Please do send me that link of that guy that you mentioned earlier, the Creationist.
oh yeah, I will send you Doug Batchelor.
All right.
I will send you the video if I can find it. And if not, I will send you the rebuttal to his speech, which I know I have somewhere in one of my older subscriptions. It might take me a while to find it though.
Well, there's no rush. Guys,
Yeah.
there is Kent with Bent on Tuesday. Thursday should be the next episode of my series about Carl Kirby and his odd sermon about fossils. Let's see. Then I believe this Wednesday there is no Guns, Magic, and Steel. It is the Wednesday after that. I'm not going to tell you to go check out Guns, Magic, and Steel unless you haven't seen any of it, in which case go to Cheshire Vic's channel. The playlist called Guns, Magic, and Steel. I think we were 16 episodes or so in. They're about 2 hours each. So if you want to see me and Guts Gibbon, Benthoven, Science Side Up, Cheshire Vic, and Guts Gibbon's fiance, and TD Lane, who's a friend of the channel, all play Dungeons and Dragons. That's the place to go. It's extremely nerdy. It's the only Dungeons and Dragons game I've ever been into. I've been in where Venturi's Principle came up as an actual aspect of the gameplay and important plot elements. So yeah. Other than that, guys, thank you very much. Please do consider joining the channel or donating to the Patreon because, like I said, I'm extremely close to this channel being a break-even proposition for me, and that is a big deal because that means that there's no end in sight that happens for Dapper Dino channel and the current pace of content. Once again, have a wonderful weekend. Stay safe out there. Later, everybody. Thanks for watching this video, but before you go, I'd like to take a minute to thank my channel members and patrons, especially those pledging $20 or above. Bob Knob, Benthoven, Denny5252, Ian Chen, John Ackerman, Chris Love, Landon Knoll, Sphincter of Doom, and Patrick Dennis. Without the help of the people whose name you see on screen right now, this channel simply wouldn't exist. If you'd like to join the team, there's links in the description to my Patreon, as well as a join button right below this video that will allow you to join on YouTube. Joining gets you access to an exclusive Discord server, early access to my videos, often more than a month in advance, as well as other perks depending on how much you decide to pledge. However, if a monthly or annual pledge isn't for you, there are other ways to support the channel, including a merch store down in the description, and hey, just liking and sharing this video always helps a lot. Thank you very much. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur.